Okay, so in this video we're going to look at what CSS actually is. So I have an example here up on the screen of a button that's been styled with CSS. We have the markup that's been created also, so we'll be able to take a look at the markup and how CSS has been used to style this, and actually, why do we need to use CSS to style elements. Let's first take a look at just an example here at how you may traditionally style an element. And if you've been working with web development already, you'll have probably styled an element in this way at some point. So without declaring any doc types or anything like that, we don't want to confuse ourselves, let's go ahead and take a look at how you might typically style up, say, a button or a link. So I'm going to go ahead and create the markup for an element here. So I'll just say click me. And in the href I'll just put a hash. We don't want this to go anywhere. So let's just go ahead and save this out here. I'll just call this example.html. And if we head over to the browser and we hit example.html, you'll see that we've just got a link here. Now let's first of all take a look at what's happened here. So we see that this is a blue link and it's got an underline to it. But how, why has this got a blue link, an underline, and why is it coloured blue? Well, if we inspect this element, and this is a fundamental part of learning CSS, and it will make learning it a hell of a lot easier. So if you right click and inspect, you can see the markup here. Now on the right hand side, I'm using Chrome. You can do this in Firefox with an extension called Firebug. You can do this with Internet Explorer, but it's probably best if you're learning web development in general to use a browser like Chrome, although obviously it is personal preference. So what we've done here is we have the ability to sort of traverse everything on the page. You see Chrome has helpfully automatically added HTML head and body. That doesn't mean we shouldn't define it. It just means it's already there. So if you are confused the fact that they're there, then that's why. So here's the markup we actually wrote in that example earlier. So just here. And you can see that on the right hand side, we've got a user agent style sheet. Now what this means is that every browser will have a specific style sheet that it uses to style up elements in the most basic form. So we've got an anchor element here, that's what A stands for, anchor, and you can see that this is blue and it's underlined. So you can see here that we've got color WebKit link, so that's almost like a variable or a shortcut, if you like, to the color defined in WebKit, which is the CSS rendering engine within Chrome. We'll won't get too much into that. The text decoration is underline, and the cursor is also. So we can change the cursor, depending on what we want it to do when it hovers over. That's part of CSS as well. So you can see it turns to this hand icon. We can actually override that if we want, and that might be something you want to do depending on what you're doing. So what we want to do is essentially with CSS, we want to override these styles. Now, CSS stands for cascading style sheets. So what that means is that anything that's hit last, or anything that's looked at last by the browser, is taken on as a style. So let's say we want this color just as a very basic, this link just as a very basic example to be red. If we said to our browser via our style sheet, which we'll look at shortly, I want this link to be red. And then later on we had maybe another style sheet, or lower down in our style sheet we had changing the color to yellow. Then what happens is, because the styles cascade, the last style will be overridden. Now there are a couple of exceptions to this, but that's sort of advanced selectors and how things do override. But generally your styles will cascade, and whatever you have last, or the last red style by the browser, will be taken on. So CSS is basically the ability to override, if you like, the default style set by the browser to make your page look more interesting. That's not to say that you couldn't have a functional page without CSS, because you could. This button could go somewhere useful, or we could write paragraphs of information on this page and they still be useful to people and people could still navigate them. So CSS is purely the presentational layer on your website. So you create your markup, you style your markup, and you make it look nice with CSS. So let's return to the other example that we had, and that's this same element pretty much. If we just go in and fix the doc type here. So we've got that. Okay, so here's our button. You can see here that on our page we've got an element here exactly the same as the example we just looked at. This has a class of button. So what this is doing is it's applying styles under the class of button, which you can see on the right hand side here. We'll take a look at that in a moment, to this element, and it makes it look a lot nicer. So if we zoom in, you can see that there's been a variety of styles applied to this. So we've got a border at the bottom. The display type has changed, which we'll look at in a separate video later, because that's a little bit difficult to understand. Our text color's changed, the underline has disappeared, we've got a slight shadow here as well. Obviously the background of this element's changed as well, and also the padding of this element, so it's pushed out a little bit. Now, if we were to remove this button class, you can see that all that happens is no class is applied, and it just reverts to the original browser styles. Now that's with one exception, and that's that I've selected the body to be styled with a certain font. So that's basically how the sort of correct way to do it. But like I said before, if you're new to web development, you may have styled elements in a slightly different way. So if we take a look at this, we can go ahead and refresh here. So this is our example. This is how we may have styled things in the past, and that's using the style attribute. So this is an attribute, and this is the value of the attribute. And what we can actually go ahead and do here is go ahead and apply styles to this element, and we can do that, and this is basically inline. Now this is still CSS, but it's not as it should be. It's basically just applying CSS styles to an element. So I could say background color, I don't know, just pick a standard green color, and this would basically be a CSS property. This is called a property, and this is called a value. So that would actually do what we want it to do, but this is the complete wrong way to go about doing things, and we'll talk about why in just a second. So we can add as many styles as we want here. We can also do things like add widths to forms, or widths to form elements, or whatever you want to do. With tables as well, you've got different. So I don't know, for example, if in 5 years ago you were laying out a page with tables, you can choose things like width on here. So you can say width 100%. Things like that. So they're the unconventional ways nowadays to style things. That was present, sort of 5 odd years ago, but now we are expected to have a separate style sheet with separate styles in. So one of the main reasons why we actually use CSS is to separate the presentation layer of our page away from the functional part. So maybe we're using JavaScript to add rich functionality to the page, and the markup as well. So we want to keep the basic reason we use CSS is to keep this separate. Now the reason we do this is because, one, it's extremely efficient, because let's say, for example, we apply, I don't know, a class, and don't worry if you don't know what this means at the moment. We had a class of button. Now what we can do is we can attach styles to this class, and what that will allow us to do is it will allow us to keep the styles separate from this element, so we don't have to have this style with all the different properties in here. So what happens then if we want to, across maybe 100 pages of our website, change the background color of buttons, or let's say we notice a bug with buttons on the page and we want to go ahead and change the padding or the margin or the display type or something like that. Well, what we can do then is all we have to do is change this in one place. We can just change the class of button. We don't need to return to every single instance of a button that we create on a page to be able to change the styles. So that's basically why we use CSS. Now, in the rest of this series, we'll be looking at actually how to style up elements and how to, looking at the difference between sort of floats, display types and things like that. And we'll be able to, by the end of this series, create nice looking elements like this while keeping all of our presentation in a separate style sheet. And that is basically the fundamentals of CSS, why we use them, and we'll go on next to look at the buzzword CSS3.